All right, so you are in week 2, Reason for Believing, and my name is Zach Fisher, for those of you who don't know me. What qualifies me to stand up here and prattle on about Jesus and all other sundry topics? I love Jesus, and I have been through seasons of doubt, and during those seasons, having reasons is very important. I'll promise not to make this autobiographical, but I have also taught a class like this before here at Grace Chapel. I have also taught several church history classes. So I am fun at parties, is what I'm trying to say. Please invite me. I thought, now I was in the wonderful woods of Washington State last week, growing a beard, beating a drum, reading poetry with a bunch of dudes. And I understand that things went well here. But I heard that there was a little bit of fun atheist role play, maybe? Is anybody here for that?
Yeah.
How did that go? What did you think of that, Brian?
That's good.
Good?
Like that, yeah.
What did you like about it?
Just kind of setting up something that's kind of real, what you're going to actually come against speaking to people.
I think it was a great move because it kind of tills the soil, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It kind of breaks stuff up. If you think that this class is nothing more than just, let's get a bunch of facts, let's get on Jeopardy, and maybe we'll make it to Final Jeopardy. Apologetics isn't a trivia thing, right? It's meant to be effective because the gospel is good news, right? Okay. I'm bringing that up because we're going to do a little bit of that again tonight. Maybe not as extensive, but I want to prepare people who weren't here last week that what's going to happen is I'm going to don a persona. All right, this person is an atheist, and I'm going to come at you with some stuff. All right, you're allowed to respond. I just ask that you raise your hand. I also want to make sure, and I know Elisa and TC did this as well, you understand that when we're role-playing, we are using arguments we've heard before. But our intention is not to drive you into doubt or despair, right? Okay? The goal is to get you thinking about how would I respond to that? And I would ask you to also think how you feel in that moment too. Is your heart pounding? Do you feel a little, wind get knocked out of your sails a little bit? We are not trying to take your personal faith stories and undermine them. Okay? Understand, we all have personal encounters with Jesus that are very important. This role play is not meant to take those and devalue them at all. Okay? So I want it to be very clear, because we're not here to mess up your faith, we're here to help build it up. Are we clear? Are we communicating?
Yep.
Amen.
All right, so in order to do this right, I have to make sure you know when I am doing atheist role play. The reason why I do that is two reasons. Number one, I just look hot in this. Number two, people are coming in, and imagine somebody coming through the door, and I'm teaching an apologetics class, and I'm like, no way Jesus existed! That would probably be a little bit of a shock to the system. So now I just have to explain why I'm wearing devil horns. Is because I have a bunch of questions that I want to ask you. So what we're going to do is for 10 minutes, I'm going to wear this ridiculous getup so that we can, all right, fine, that's great. I'm going to ask you questions, and you're going to have fun while I completely deflate your faith. I think that's what I have. Yes, deflate their faith. All right, so I'm going to need 10 minutes on the clock.
Okay.
You had one job, TC.
I'm sorry. The pressure. Uh-oh.
I just
Not
need
good
10
reads.
minutes.
See,
Welcome
now
back.
that you're
I'm
stressing
sorry.
me out, I'll get every app except for
Nope, that was the right room.
Oh, shoot.
okay, 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Ready?
Hello. My name is, I didn't even come up with a name. Owen Wilson? No. Somebody give me a name. Quick, Scott, give me a name.
Adrian Bradford.
Adrian Bradford. Ooh. completely fictitious individual, correct? My name is Adrian Bramford. I used to be a Christian. That was until I studied it. Now I teach in Princeton, and I tell all my students that Christianity is a lie. It's false. Hi. So, now, I'm going to take this off for just a second. There was, if I recall correctly, last week there were a couple questions, a couple things that can be asked in moments like this, okay? So what I'm trying to do is set up, everyone here is a Christian, and I'm a teacher. I tell all my students Christianity is a lie. Anybody got any questions for me? What's your name, sir?
My name is Glenn.
Glenn. What question do you have for Adrian Bramford?
What do you mean by that?
What do I mean by that?
That Christianity is a lie.
Christianity is a lie. You know, that's a great question. And I want to thank you for asking that question by making a TP with my hands. What I mean by that is that Jesus is absolute fiction. He never existed. And so if Jesus never existed, then how can Christianity be true, right? So that's what I mean when I say Christianity is a lie.
Just going back to the first statement in your answer, that Jesus never existed, how did you come to that conclusion?
Somebody was listening.
Gold star.
I applaud you, Glenn. How did I come to that conclusion? I'm so glad you asked, Glenn. Was anybody else wondering how I came to that
Yes.
conclusion? Yeah. Well, wow, such a pleasant room. I was expecting to get a lot more, flamethrower. Okay. Well, I've read the entire Bible. Okay, so start there. And I've studied history. I've read all of Philip Schaff's 8-volume set of Christian history. Over a weekend. It was a bender. I also have read Charles Gibbon's History of Rome. I don't know if anybody else here has read Charles Gibbon's History of Rome. Huge, big, thick, voluminous tome. But I read it, because that's what I do, and I read things. And so here's what I found out for myself. I found out that the only evidence that Jesus existed, completely biased, right? The only evidence that's out there is the same as like religious propaganda, kind of. It would be a bit like going to, I don't know, DonaldTrump.org and asking the question, who should I vote for president? What do you think the answer is going to be? They have a personal vestment in that idea. So all these sources for Jesus that you would use, and I assume we would be talking about the Bible here, completely biased. It's written by religious people who have a particular philosophical, religious, whatever bias to believe that it's true. That's point one. I have 3 points and not a prayer. Jesus never claimed to be God. When I did read these biased religious propaganda that I heard were called the Gospels, I never really found a place where he just flat out said, hey, I am the Son of God. I am the Messiah. I'm all the things that I presume most of you believe about him. Okay, so that's point number 2. And the third point is that I believe that early Christianity really invented this myth. They took pieces from myths that were kind of in the water at the time, and maybe they were losing some political footing or something, and they needed to find a way for their idea to compete in the marketplace of ideas. So they took these different bits and pieces. And what do I mean by bits and pieces? I mean like Horus, an Egyptian god who was written about in 3000 BC, who was born on December 25th of a virgin, who was baptized by Anup the baptizer, who performed miracles, one of which included raising someone named Azar, which translates to what? Lazarus. And he was crucified, died, was resurrected on the 3rd day, and was referred to in Egyptian literature as the Son of God. That was from 3000 BC, well before all this other Christian propaganda started getting in the water. And that's just one example. There's Mithras. Mithras was a Roman, I would say god. He was usually worshipped by the military, but same kind of thing happening there. Birthday, December 25th. Star in the sky, born of a virgin. I mean, if you kind of set these figures, these mythical figures, Horus, Mithras, Quetzalcoatl, and on and on and on, what you'll kind of find is that point for point, there already existed myths, mythical figures that predated Jesus. So when you ask the question, what do I mean that Christianity is a lie? I come to that conclusion, or that belief that Jesus didn't exist, precisely because any source that I find is written by people who already believe it to be true and have much to lose if it isn't. What they've put into the mouth of Jesus doesn't even explicitly state that he's the Son of God in those scriptures, and then later, centuries later, as a way to keep Christianity in the mix, so to speak, of the Roman Empire, they borrowed heavily from Persian and Roman mystery and fertility cults, and just fixated them onto this person named Jesus Christ. Which means what? Which means most likely he's a mythical figure in the imagination of the early church, much like Sherlock Holmes is a figure in the mind of what, Sir Conan Doyle, anyway, that guy who wrote Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, so, I mean, that's kind of, in a nutshell, I mean, that's a big nutshell, but that's how I came to the
I
conclusion.
applaud you for your long-windedness.
Yeah.
One clarifying point, not to speak too long, but you said in your second response point, Jesus never said he was the Son of God.
He never claimed to be God.
Okay. Why do you care what somebody says if you don't think they ever existed?
That's a good question. I put that statement in there because I start from the idea that Jesus, by the way, time check. I think I just heard somebody say.
2 minutes left.
2 minutes left. I put that in there because, so the only evidence about him is biased, right? But even when we go and check out those biased sources, why would people who are so biased and want so much to believe about Jesus, it's almost like they kind of missed the mark. Like they missed a perfect opportunity to put words into the mouth of Jesus, that he was the Son of God. Answer it for once and for all. It almost seems to me like they were kind of just towing the line a little bit, just getting up to the edge, but then something kept them from going all the way with it. And then somebody later came in behind them and created those myths and things like that. I hope that kind of answers the question. Judging by your expression, I may not have.
Well, that's just a personal, persistent dissatisfaction I have with college professors.
Well, lucky for you, you know.
Thank you for your time.
Sure. I'll yield to the gentleman from
The
Louisiana.
gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you. All right, so thank you, Glenn. Does anybody else have any questions you want to ask?
Do you believe that Jesus was a man that walked the earth?
No.
No.
No, I don't think Jesus left any footprints in the sand of Palestine. Yes. By the way, what's your name?
Rachel.
Hi, Rachel. My wife's name. No, my wife's name is Rachel. I don't have a wife because I'm not very popular with people.
So, like, I mean, so I grew up in a pretty, like, educated society and stuff like that. And in public school, and I never once heard anyone ever say that they didn't believe Jesus existed.
Really?
Like,
Wow.
I mean, definitely they didn't believe he was God, and didn't believe that he was the Son of God, or that he was supernatural. But I've never heard anybody say they didn't believe that he existed. Like, and he would be in, you know, in history books, and if you had a religion class, I mean, they would talk about him as a person who lived.
Ah,
So I've actually never heard atheists ever say that before.
interesting. Well, I just did, and now I'm done.
What was Mithras' mother's name?
Mrs. Mithras?
Do people
All right.
actually believe that?
I'm sorry?
Do they? Really?
Well, they're rare.
Okay.
Okay, now, what we need to do here is we need to do a little debrief, okay? Or debrief. If it's not obvious, the subject of today's class is the person of Jesus. And precisely how we might answer challenges to claim or claims that he never existed. Because if Jesus never existed, then he couldn't have been the things that our faith say that he is, right? The Son of God, miracle worker, all the things that come in tow. Jesus has to exist first in order to be the Son of God and died, buried, resurrected, all those things, right? I mean, that makes sense, right? If that doesn't quite, I think this might be helpful. What I want to try to give you is a picture of what happened to Adrian Bramford, how Adrian came to this this conclusion. Here, and I hope you can see it. I'll move this out of the way. Hopefully, you all recognize what this is, right? Everybody familiar with the game of Jenga? All right. If you can't see from the back, the game of Jenga is essentially these little blocks, and they're 3 to a row, and they just crisscross like this, and they stack up and create a tower. But the reason why I'm using, and this is you. What this represents is Christianity. Now, what do I mean by that? Each of these little blocks represents a particular belief about Christianity. It could be the smallest belief. It could be the largest belief. It could be the Trinity, okay? Maybe that's the Trinity. Probably not the right place. Or my denomination is the right denomination. I don't know. What I'm trying to say here is in everybody's mind, they put together beliefs from the time they're born, and they construct them in interlocking ways to create what we will talk about in future classes, what's called a worldview. Worldview is important, but worldviews don't go unchallenged. So what happened to Adrian Bramford as he went about his wonderful career is he began to encounter questions. And some of them were meager at first, perhaps. Things like, hey, how come some Christians are hypocrites? So Christians may not be consistent in their behavior with the Bible. And so he has to do something with that belief. And what we do with worldview is when a belief gets attacked and we have to investigate it, sometimes it doesn't go back right the way it would in the first place. It gets moved, much like the game of Jenga. Maybe he encountered an argument that said, hey, how come there's so many different, can I do it? Hey, come on.
Grab the middle one.
Maybe I do want to grab the middle one.
Mess up the visual.
How about this one? Hey, boy, this belief wasn't very, denominations, okay? Christians, they have different denominations. Well, what is that all about? Okay, you get down to it, and there's a lot of more things that they share in common than they do uncommon. So, okay, it doesn't quite fit back in, so I have to put it in a different place. And you on and on and on it goes. But what happens when those questions start coming in that look like there's no unbiased evidence for Jesus? Any evidence that we find is really mythical because he's not really saying the things that we're saying about him. And if he's mythical, then Jesus didn't exist. No unbiased sources. Absolute mythical claims projected back by early Christianity, lead us to the one conclusion that brings it all down. Jesus did not exist. That's what happened to Adrian Bramford, and that's what happens to Christians born and raised. They encounter these ideas, they don't know what to do with them in their structure, and what ends up happening? Eventually, it works its way down to the very bottom. You get no deeper than Jesus when it comes to Christianity. You take Jesus out of the equation, you've got something else. And now what Adrian Bramford has to do is take these beliefs and reassemble them with a different foundation. We'll get into that more in the worldview class, okay? But everybody has to construct a worldview. You don't get through this life without one. So, what we need to do is we need to kind of take these arguments. Let's see. This is where I probably can write something down. I think if I just wrote down the word no unbiased evidence, right? Argument number 2, never claimed to be God. And the third one, what was the third one again? Oh,
Myth.
all myth. It's just all myth. We could kind of put those into a funnel, and we can attack it with, it really boils down to this. Did Jesus exist? Question number 1. Okay, meaning, like Brian asked, was there somebody who left footprints in the sand of Palestine back in the 1st century? And if he exists, was he God? Those are the 2 categories we're going to look at tonight. What I intend to do is to give just nuggets of answers, evidences, things that you can tuck into these 2 categories. Because if you can answer these to the affirmative, you do much to put these back in their right place. What I want you to learn tonight, among other things about apologetics and the approach that we're taking to apologetics, is this: the idea that there are sowers and there are harvesters. Some people have the idea that apologetics is only when you get somebody to sign on to the bottom line. That's not always the case. Sometimes your job is just to put, as one person said, a rock in their shoe. Mm-hmm. Something that causes them to go, I didn't think about that before. That's what Glenn was doing to me back there. You might have noticed. He was trying to put a rock in my shoe. He never tried to close the deal, right? He was just trying to put a rock in my shoe. That's why I want to just ask you to help put back the pieces. That's all you're trying to do here. You're not trying to reconstruct the entire tower, okay? That's the work of the Holy Spirit. But if you can help them put one piece back, you've done a lot, okay? Don't ever shortchange yourself if they didn't, sign up and walk the aisle. But if you've got them to think, well, wait, maybe there is some evidence I haven't thought about before, you've done a lot, especially in this culture, right? By the way, great verse. I think it was Proverbs 18:10. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run to it and are safe. Okay. So now we move into the part, did Jesus exist? Yes. Next. One thing you gotta, an argument you might hear that really is under this category of did Jesus exist? Well, first of all, you can't use the Bible because it's biased, right? That's something that I was saying up here. Hey, it's just religious propaganda. That's like going to Trump.org and figuring out who I should run for, I should vote for, or something like that. Here's things that I would ask a person who is saying you can't use the Bible because it's biased. By the way, feel free to chime in if I overlooked something here. first question I would ask, does anybody have an idea of what unbiased evidence would look like? What exactly would the evidence look like that they're looking for?
Historical evidence?
Yeah, what would that look like? Rachel, you
Well,
raised your
just,
hand.
yeah, like I was just saying, like, in history books, other people who lived during the time who saw him or his disciples or,
Yeah,
like, firsthand accounts
what you're
of his
describing,
existence.
and what you're describing there, see, this is one of the things that has intrigued me about this idea of unbiased evidence. As if to encounter Jesus, you just walk away like you might walk away from Napoleon Bonaparte or something. You know, like, oh, well, there he was, and now he's dead. Did some great things, and on we go. To me, if Jesus was who he said he was, if somebody wants to write about him, they're probably going to be pretty impassioned about that, right? I mean, it's not to say that other people wouldn't write about him, but I would imagine that if people are encountering him and being interested in him, are wanting to preserve his ideas that they're a part of now, because they're embracing it. It's kind of hard to come to Jesus and say, well, no, I don't really think that you're the Son of God. Now, why am I going to waste my time writing about you? That's maybe one argument. Maybe not the best one. But would we expect the Sadducees to write something about Jesus? Would we expect Pontius Pilate to write something about Jesus? Yes.
Wasn't there a Jewish rabbi? I don't know his name, but there was a lot of he wrote about Jesus, a lot of things that Jesus did.
Yeah.
And he was unbiased because I don't think he actually believed that Jesus was the Son of God, but he was in his town. And
We're going to come to that.
Okay.
So hold on to that
Okay,
thought. Make
cool.
sure you remind me in about 5 minutes to
Okay.
come back to that idea. Okay.
I'll set the timer.
Yeah. You're on timer. You got 2 jobs. So, if we're really saying that unbiased evidence, I mean, what is bias? Somebody who has a personal investment in the story, right? Well, on that argument, why should I believe accounts of the Holocaust that come to us through people like, who just died recently? Wetzel
Can't remember his name, yeah.
was a Holocaust survivor.
Corey Timber.
Yeah, and I should not listen to him, but I should probably have listened to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the guy who was the president of Iran until 2013, who believed that the Holocaust was all made up. I should believe him more than I should believe somebody who lived through it. I mean, we're not talking about somebody writing about a day in the park in Jerusalem. We're talking about somebody who claimed to be the Son of God. Why would we be surprised that people were passionate when they wrote about him? The third thing I would say is that historians, and Rachel, you brought this up, historians do treat it as a historical document. They may not treat it as a holy book or a sacred text. They may not be spiritually invested into it, but they do treat it as an historical document. So, frankly, when I stood before you and said that there was, this document is biased and we can't use it as history, that's wrong. That's not just wrong, that's like super wrong. Historians do use it. So if historians do use it as history, that should do a lot to do damage to this idea that we can't use the Bible. Okay? So, and it also helps when you have people like, who here has heard of Bart Ehrman? Bart Ehrman, anyone? Scott, what do you know of Bart Ehrman?
Well, I know he used to be a Christian and then basically rejected it, sort of in the same sequence as what you're describing. He just became a skeptic and eventually submitted to it.
Yes, exactly right. And
And now he's one of the chief thinkers on the other side of the argument.
exactly, he's a textual critic, I believe, right? And he's in North Carolina?
He teaches at, Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Now, I'm going to get this wrong, so I'm looking at you, TC. He said, I was looking at you, TC. I should go back to that slide to figure out who you are. You weren't wearing your Lego arm, so I don't know who you are. At least What does Bart Ehrman say about the Bible?
Well, he absolutely grants them as historical documents. Now, he believes Jesus existed. He's not atheist, he's agnostic. But the vast majority of even atheist New Testament scholars will grant the New Testament documents historical status. And part of the reason is because there's no such thing as an unbiased historical document anywhere.
Correct. I mean,
Any
yeah.
human being that writes something is gonna have a bias.
Good point. Did you catch that in the back? Right? That's important.
So just as a quick teaching point, what I would have asked him when he was saying all that, I would have said, Mr. Bramford, thank you for being here and for just being willing to stand in front of a group of Christians and crash our hopes.
Well, I would have been here sooner, but I was eating a baby.
But
so-
I would, I would have asked him if he believes history can be known, because there are people who don't believe history can be known. And if they don't believe history can be known, well, Christianity's not going to interest them anyway if they don't believe history.
Yeah.
But if he would have answered, yes, I do believe history can be known, then I would have gone to that, like, well, what, can you give me an example of an unbiased historical account of anything anywhere? You
Yeah.
know, and maybe just start there.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
I would even wanna know what your unbiased evidence for the myths you mentioned were.
That's another good one.
Mhm. Well, just you wait.
You wanted that you believed it so vehemently.
They're coming. Yes. I'm sorry. Your name, please.
Brett,
Brett. Hi.
what about just the fact that over half of the Bible was written before Jesus ever came? As far as a bias toward whether Jesus existed,
Mhm.
even though it didn't speak necessarily directly of Jesus, but there's so many things that occurred in the Old Testament that foretold of Jesus coming.
You're speaking here of prophecy, right? That so the Old Testament has so many prophecies that point to the person.
But specifically about that being, I agree with what TC said and Lisa said about it, that there really being no unbiased, but that being maybe as close as you could ever get to an unbiased, thing, something that's written before something happened,
Mm.
you know.
If I put my horns back on, and I'm not going to, what I imagine somebody who might wear the horns would say, well, no, that actually is biased because the books of the Old Testament were given to a particular people at a particular time. As a Christian, of course, we believe them to be true, okay? I want to be careful here. But they were given to a particular people at a particular time. So in other words, there already was a bias for these people to believe it, and therefore to look for satisfaction of these prophecies in their own culture. We don't find the Hammurabi or the Hittites or whatever with their sacred texts looking for their prophetic Messiah. That's something pretty unique to Judaism. Maybe not, again, a great argument, but they would still push against you with the claim it's still biased because it's a particular people. Am I even remotely on the right track?
Well, I'm not totally sure I understand your question. Like biased, like
I agree
proving
that-
Jesus, or
Well, I agree that it's biased about what it told that is.
are you talking about the prophecies about the Messiah? Or?
Well, the prophecies, which is pretty much almost the whole Old Testament prophesied Jesus, it seems, but it's like, it seems like to me they're biased in maybe the stories they told about the history that occurred, but then you look at kind of like the backstory or whatever that's going on. Just Isaac and the ram and all that kind of stuff, and all these things that happen, they're like, wow, that's so similar to what happened, several thousand years later, and then, any one occurrence is, who cares? One occurrence, that's a fluke thing.
Mm.
But when you add those up, it's like all these things tell all this stuff that seems to have happened, that was written about by some man, at least penned or chiseled or whatever by some man,
Yeah.
before Jesus. And I'm talking about bias specific, not to whether the Hittites existed or whether those things happened, but bias towards whether it was biased about Jesus, even though it didn't specifically speak of Jesus.
Yeah.
It did. We believe,
Brett,
but
if you would excuse me for just a sec, I think you're on the right track here. With regard to the question, only in the interest of time, and also knowing that later in the semester we really get digging into the Bible from the front to back, you know, the textual criticism and things like
We're
that.
reading it from cover to cover.
Yes.
On session 6.
Next
And
week, everybody-
I'm bringing my 8 volumes of Philip Schaff, and we're gonna sit down and do it all. But what I'm saying is, I think you need to hold to that question and drop that in the middle of the Bible class.
I get what he was saying though, as far as it would be maybe unbiased, because they didn't even know Jesus existed yet, so how could it be biased about Jesus? I get what you, I think that's what you're trying to say.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
I think we'll find that, there was a joke that someone told me one time about somebody who believed he was dead. He kept believing he was dead, he kept believing he was dead. Nobody could tell him, you know, you're alive, you're alive. And finally he goes to the doctor, and the doctor's like, look, cuts his arm, he starts bleeding, and says, look, you're bleeding. And the guy looks at his arms and goes, huh, dead guys bleed too.
Yeah.
Right, so there's a philosophical commitment to people who would hear, hey, the Old Testament is unbiased, and then we go, no, it's not. All the Old Testament is, and those prophecies are Darwinian fulfillments, and we don't get into that.
Yeah.
But there will be a counter argument. It's like ping pong almost. With every play that we make, there is a counter play, and I don't think we need to be afraid of the word bias. I think that's the point here.
Right.
Like you said, everybody who's going to write anything is biased. Facebook is run amok with bias. That doesn't necessarily mean I get my scripture from, well, actually some people write scripture all the time. But anyway, you get what I'm saying. Next point. Well, actually, let's close this out with a quote. People who insist on evidence taken only from writings outside the New Testament don't understand what they're asking us, that is Christians, to do. They're demanding that we ignore the earliest primary sources about Jesus in favor of sources that are later, secondary, and less reliable, which is just crazy as historical methodology. So, to the claim that there is no unbiased evidence, and we can't use the Bible as unbiased evidence, well, it is biased, but that's okay. Let's go to the next point, though. If we can use the Bible, there's still this nagging problem for some people. Is there any documents outside of the Bible that might speak to Jesus? The answer is yes, okay? And I think we were talking earlier today with somewhere about a dozen, 10 or so, 10, and we only have time to look at 3 tonight, okay? Unfortunately, one of those 3 is not. I believe you were speaking about Josephus, and Josephus has a very interesting story behind the claim of what's in his writings. Fairly controversial, and so for that reason, I decided to pick 3 really strong ones, okay? The first is Mara Bar. Everybody say it together. No, okay, Mara. Let's just say Mara. Mara was a dude, late 1st century, writing a letter to his son. Mara wants his son, Serapion, I believe that. I guess that's how we're gonna pronounce it tonight. He wants his son to pursue wisdom. Okay, so Mara is within the Roman culture, and trying to be a good dad, right? Okay, so let's look at what he wrote to his son. For what advantage did the Athenians gain by the murder of Socrates? Okay, so he's talking about Socrates was murdered, and basically the land in which Socrates lived got a famine and pestilence. Okay, lock that away in your brain. Or the people of Samos by the burning of Pythagoras. Remember Pythagoras? Didn't he give us geometry or something?
Loved his theorem.
Loved his theorem. So glad they burned him. And because in 1 hour, their country was entirely covered in sand. Or the Jews by the death of their wise king, because from that same time their kingdom was taken away. Okay, what he's saying, here's 3 figures who were murdered by their people, and because they were murdered for their wisdom, bad things happened to their land. He goes on. God, now you got to understand here, this is a philosophical God. This is not, God of God justly avenged these 3 wise men. The Athenians died of hunger. The Samians were overwhelmed by the sea. The Jews, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on in the teaching of Plato. Pythagoras did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given. Now, I know a lot of you are reading that and go, so close. He lived on in his teaching. Geez, that sounds a lot like stuff we would have found in the 20th century from Bultmann and people like that. But let's take a couple things from here. Number one, knowing that a father is trying to write to his son and instill the virtue of wisdom. Notice the characters that he uses. Question, does anybody doubt the existence of Socrates? I see a big ol' X. No. Does anybody doubt the existence of Pythagoras? No. So, by process of elimination, did the wise king exist?
Yes.
Yes, I believe he did. Why would a father who's trying to instill wisdom all of a sudden do a 90-degree turn in his examples? He's trying to use history to do this, okay? Now, the wise king, but he doesn't say Jesus. And when I taught this last time, there were a lot of people like, he didn't say Jesus, wise king, that could be anybody. Do your forensic files. I wish I had that soundtrack there. Do your forensic file stuff. ID channel. Don't. Yeah. Wise king. So who were wise kings in Judaism? Give me some names.
Solomon.
Solomon, David, Jesus. Okay. So that's just three. Now let's go through process of elimination. What he said by here. The death of their wise king. At the same time, their kingdom was taken away. Now, when David died, was the kingdom taken away?
Nope.
Nope. When Solomon died, was the kingdom taken away?
Nope.
Nope. When Jesus died, was the kingdom taken away? Let's add this little piece right here, and the Jews driven out in dispersion. Careful. Careful. Because if you're super precise on this, you'll say, well, if Jesus was crucified in 30, 34, whatever. Well, the Jews were still in Jerusalem until something happened that Jesus predicted. What was that? Destruction of the temple. What year was that? 70. Remember that. It's important. It's going to come up when we talk about the Bible. So this particular wise king died, and his people were dispersed before this letter was written. An historical figure within the Jews was a wise king, had great teaching, and when he was killed, they were dispersed from their land. Process of elimination. Can't be Solomon, can't be King David. Who could it be? I submit to you it's Jesus. Now, he would have no commitments to Christianity to say that anything other than he lived on in good teaching. So we can't necessarily use this as evidence of anything more than, as far as Mara was concerned, Jesus was a great teacher and a wise king of the Jews. But that's a lot. Let's take a look at another.
Zach,
Yes.
what was that document, or what was that just a letter found?
It's a letter. Yeah. This was another letter from Pliny the Younger to the Emperor Trajan, written in the year 112. Pliny was a bureaucrat. Pliny lived in Turkey, I guess what we'd call it now. Pliny had a problem because there were these people running around called Christians, and they just wouldn't follow the rules. So he was writing, like a good bureaucratic would do, he was complaining up and asking the emperor, hey, what should I do about these people? He wrote, it's about 3 paragraphs. You should definitely sometime take a look at it because it's profound what he observed about this group called Christians. But one thing that he wrote, these Christians, were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God. We're going to construct a timeline later here, but this is a Roman official observing Christian worship. And who are they worshiping? What I don't have here is later on in the document he talks about how he wants to know more about them, so he kidnapped a couple of the deaconesses and tortured them, and they wouldn't give up. it's pretty amazing to think that you could kidnap people, torture them, and they were somehow living for a figure that didn't exist. Number 3. Tacitus, Annals, written in 116. Tacitus, a Roman historian. He's talking here about Nero. Everybody remember Nero? Rome burned in a day, and he blamed it on the Christians. So here's how we know that happened. Nero fastened the guilt of the burning of Rome and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, in bold there, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, but the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Huge. This document not only attests to the death of a figure named Christus and people who take up the belief, but also the spread. Here it is, 116. Now it's showing up in Rome. Of course, we're not surprised by that. But here's somebody outside the Bible, that biased document that it is, saying, yeah, they're here, and look what they're doing. And we don't like them. Don't have time to talk about it, but in Roman society, superstition was a big deal. Superstition was something that they would call somebody or a group of people who didn't believe that Caesar is God. They would also refer to Christians as atheists, believe it or not. So there's a lot to be dug in here, but just 3 quick outside extra New Testament documents that speak to there was a person named Christ and he had followers who were willing to be killed for him in less than a century after he was crucified and ascended. Okay, so let me see where I am in our notes. Any questions so far? I know there usually is one.
Can I say something about the
No.
Josephus thing that he was in?
Yes, you may, please.
Well, I just wanted to just give a little comment on the Josephus quote, because the reason Zach's not using him is it's called a Testimonium Flaventum, and that is debated because there's this really what's the word, like fantastical version of it where Josephus is calling Jesus God, and it's obviously embellished. They found earlier copies of it. They did textual criticism, so there is a fairly well agreed upon in the scholarship world version of the Testimonium where he's not calling Jesus God, but he definitely mentions him. Some people won't use that quote for the resurrection evidence, but the thing that's really important to remember about Josephus is that's not the only time he mentioned Jesus. He mentions Jesus another time, and that's not debated at all. That is fully and totally accepted on a scholarship level across the board. And the reason that's so strong is because Josephus would have been actually anti-Christian. Like his bias would have actually been in the other direction as a Jew.
Right.
So I just want to clarify, just so they don't think that we can't trust the Josephus thing. I understand why you didn't use the Flaventum, but just, to know that even just for the existence of Jesus, Josephus is actually a fairly strong source on that.
What's the other quote?
Well, it's not, it
Talking
doesn't have a
about
name.
James,
Oh, it
the
doesn't.
death of James.
It's talking about the death of James, and
Okay.
it's, that one's not contested, so.
One other reason why I don't bring that one up is because, and for all the reasons that you said, but also, if you bring these 3 up, those are pretty powerful punches. You bring up Josephus, there's the possibility. The counter arguments, if you're not careful, can be very persuasive. I read some stuff recently and I was like, wow, okay, I don't want to set anybody up to go blazing a trail and then all of a sudden they hit that site that goes, that Josephus thing, here's why that doesn't work, and now all of a sudden you're like, oh, Zach broke my faith, So again, you can use it, but it's one of those things that's like used with caution. Expect a fight.
Well, expectified if you use the fluventum, but the other one is uncontested.
Yeah, and the stuff
For
that
the
I read.
existence of Jesus. Now, if you're doing resurrection, it's a little bit of a different.
I'm right.
I'm sorry.
No, you all have no
Should
idea
I
how
set a
much.
timer?
No, you all have no idea how much I lean on TC, was it? I see a hand.
I'll take
Brett.
credit for it.
Yes, sir.
How would you respond to not this one, but although this one kind of flies, but the last one about the hymn sung to Christ as God? Wouldn't that be similar to saying, well, see, Jesus exists because every Sunday up here there's a bunch of people singing hymns to Christ?
In other words, there's continuity, I'm using a different word, between our worship of Christ as a God extending all the way back to the year 112. And there's something to that? You think there's something to that? I agree. The forms of worship have changed, okay?
No, I'm actually more wearing your little silly
you want the
horns a little bit.
Yeah.
Just playing devil's
And just saying that, like, because if I said, well, Christ obviously existed because there's people that show up at Grace Chapel every Sunday morning and they sing worship songs to him.
Good point.
That doesn't really prove Christ exists. And now, I would argue a little bit that obviously in AD 112, you're much more closer to the crime scene or the
Yeah.
event,
Yeah.
right, than we are in the year 2016. But there's still a little bit something to be said for the fact that it's like, well, that's like saying, what I just said, that just because.
Yes. Now, then let's do this thought experiment. Let's take Grace Chapel and everybody singing in church and raising their hands and praising the name of Jesus. Let's airlift the entire sanctuary in the middle of the service at the high mark and put it on a sea, what's the big, anyway, it gets carried across the ocean, it gets dropped right in the middle of an ISIS training camp. Do you think that changes the nature of worship? Because to worship anything in America, well, that's easy. You can worship anything you want. That's one of the things about America that's supposedly, it's so great. But you drop that in the middle of a hostile environment with people choosing to worship Jesus when their life is on the line, that changes the quality a little bit. For me, it does. Does that make sense?
So what you're saying is that in AD 112, the scene would have looked a little bit more like being dropped into the middle of an ISIS camp, and maybe not exactly that.
Yeah,
but it would have been
I'm
a much
going
more
to the
hostile
extreme.
environment to have been openly worshiping Jesus.
Yeah, you're basically wearing the wrong colors in LA, in the middle of the 80s, right? Was it reds and bloods? You're showing up with your fuchsia, and they're like, well, anyway.
Exactly. Basically, worshiping Jesus in a hostile environment at a time where there actually could have been, I don't know, do you think there could have still been eyewitnesses alive? Or people that were children of eyewitnesses alive?
Oh.
Where it would have been real easy to say you're worshiping a myth, or no one.
Do you
there's
think
never
this is
been-
the time where I need to do the drawing
Oh,
that
okay,
I did?
I don't know, I'm sorry, I just was thinking, bringing that up, is
I think I can
it's
clarify.
different than us
Please.
today, so many years just removed. I mean, this is within a generation of the actual guy in a hostile environment, which makes it even, the chances of worshiping someone who didn't exist.
Well, and I think the one thing we have to bear in mind is we're making a cumulative case. I agree with you, this one quote does not prove Jesus existed. But you put this with all the other ones and the New Testament documents, you're looking at a pretty good case, as well as the fact that there were active apologists writing against Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd century. None of them ever suggested Jesus didn't exist. So it's a cumulative case.
Yeah.
We're putting pieces of evidence together. But your point is well made, and I agree with you. That's not enough. But put it all
I
together.
think the hostile environment.
Yeah,
thing
it
was
helps to
actually something
strengthen
that-
the quote, but.
Yeah, as I was making the comparison to
But that was a very
today,
good point, though, that
I
this
wasn't
is just
thinking
saying
about
they
that,
were
yeah.
singing
Yeah.
to him. But, you put all the pieces together, and that's really what we need to think, is when we're making a cumulative case.
Because little kids sing to Barney, and that doesn't.
Right, that doesn't mean Barney exists, right? Yeah.
Wait, what?
So sorry, Zach.
I wore the shirt for him! I hope I'm not not coming down on you like an 800-pound sack of hammers or anything like that, because I think you're making a great point. Maybe not 800 pounds. I've been dieting, so maybe it's just okay, so let's now there's a little laser there. Did Jesus exist? So we just put a couple categorical things there. Now we want to talk about was he God? Now to do that, we kind of have to approach that two-pronged approach when you stand it up on two legs. Because was Jesus God? Well, first you got to answer: did Jesus claim to be God? Right. So did he have a divine self-understanding? That's pretty important. And then did other people believe that he was God? If you don't have both of those, you have there's potential for, well, he was a lunatic or myth or whatever. That's the problem with the mythical approach, is that people just think that Jesus didn't say it and that we just projected back. Anyway, all the stuff that Devil Horns over here said. So let's ask the question, did he believe that he was? This is, to the person who says Jesus never flat out claimed to be God. The answer to that is he did. He absolutely did. What you have to understand is that Jesus was saying things to Jews that Jews understood very clearly was a messianic claim. 20th century American eyes read that and say, oh no, he didn't come out and say it. I mean, Pontius Pilate was right there. Come on, he could have done that. He could have said so much better. But if you get the context right, you understand exactly what he was saying. I had a situation happen one time, just to illustrate context matters when things aren't said. I was in a doctor's office one time, getting an x-ray on my leg. The doctor looked at my x-ray, and I saw his eyebrow raise. And then he turns to the nurse and says, see that Mr. Fisher gets an appointment with Dr. So-and-so this afternoon? Make sure his schedule is open.
Sounds serious.
Yeah. That doesn't sound to me like, and make sure you give an aspirin on the way home. That sounds, I don't know what it is, but I just saw two health professionals say something to each other in some kind of health professional code that said to me, you know, do you have like a second head that's going to pop out of his head? What do you mean, man? So context means a lot. And in the Jewish context, what Jesus was saying in that waiting room communicated very clearly to those people. I have to, for the interest of times, I have to just kind of do this bullet point. I will put these notes up. I think we're going to find a way to get those out on a site. I might put up a blog or something so that you can capture these. But I am indebted to TC, Elisa. I'm indebted to Elisa, and for your you did this laminate card last year, and so I borrowed all of these. Just very quickly, Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. Peter's confession in Matthew. The woman at the well in John. Jesus claimed to be God, and the Jewish authorities knew it. The parable of the vineyard in Matthew. He professed equality with God in John. He also proclaims that he is the I Am. It's a pretty important name and title right there. Jesus performed works only God can do. He forgives the sins of others, raises the dead, judges all people. If you're going to take a picture, there's one more. The forgiveness of sins of others, that one is really, you've got to camp on that for just a second, because I think that's pretty profound. If I remember correctly, it was one thing to say, go to somebody and say, I forgive you for doing something wrong to me. Okay, that was, we all know that. But for somebody to come into that situation and say, I forgive you for doing that horrible thing to that person over there, that's a completely different thing, especially in the Jewish understanding of forgiveness. How can you do that? The only person who can give forgiveness in that situation is God. Yet here you are doing that. That was one of those waiting room moments. That was the doctor screaming to the nurse, make sure that they have an appointment open. that one always strikes me of all these. Jesus accepted worship from wise men, from lepers, from a ruler, from a blind man, an anonymous woman, Mary Magdalene, and his disciples. There you go. And there's more. That's just like a quarter of your laminate card. There's more on the back, but do you have any of those anymore?
I don't think I do.
Well, one thing that's a huge point is he would not have been crucified if he wasn't claiming to be God.
Good point.
Because
Did you catch that in the back?
the reason he was crucified was for heresy. And that was, so that's one of the biggest evidences to me that he must have been claiming it.
Well, and a couple of these claims too that, you know, to us in English don't necessarily sound like a deity claim. That's when they picked up stones to stone him. Now, these were really religious Pharisees. This is why they didn't try to stone him any other time, because they weren't allowed to. But when he made the claim, that was blasphemy, and they could stone him for that. And that's why, after a couple of these verses, like when he says, I am, they tore their clothes, they picked up stones to stone him, because they're like, we've got him. Like, we can kill him for that by the law. So they definitely understood that he was committing, in their mind, blasphemy by claiming to be the Messiah.
What
claiming to be
about,
God.
was the one, the Isaiah scroll, is that part of it, when he said, today this
I don't think
is
they
fulfilled
did.
in your midst?
I don't know if they picked up stones. I have to refresh. I know at least twice they picked up stones to stone him, but
But that was talking about, I've come to heal the brokenhearted and bind up their wounds, and he says, today this is fulfilled in your midst.
Yeah. That was
So
when he
I-
was like 12, I think.
No, I think that was older. Well,
he was
maybe
older.
He was older.
I think that was that was in his ministry.
That was the start.
Like the start.
Sorry, I'm getting confused with the Father's house. Sorry.
That's okay.
Who's teaching this class? Finally, oh, well, not finally, actually, there's a couple more. Okay, so, actually, before I blaze into this one, did you catch enough, couple morsels there that Jesus did claim to be God, did claim to be Messiah? Did you catch those? Okay, and there are more. Just, yes, sir.
Well, I don't know if we have time to talk about this at all, but my main reason for being here is because my mom and dad have gone through, their Jenga fell. Their whole world's fallen apart based on the internet and so forth. And so all those scriptures that you're giving as evidence for Jesus' claim, what is that based on? What scriptural interpretation is that based on? Is that straight Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek? Like what?
You're
what is-
getting into the textual criticism. You're
Okay.
getting into.
Are we doing that next week? Is it-
No, I think, well, we can, but TC, I'm gonna
Well,
throw the ball to you on this
You
one.
mean
TC,
Lisa?
Elisa.
So I'm trying to understand your question when you say, are they wanting to know about the integrity of the actual text? Like, does it
Yes.
did they really write what we're reading?
Yes.
Yeah, we're gonna do a whole class on
Okay,
that.
cool.
Yeah.
All right, that's fine.
Mhm.
Okay, so I wanna make sure everybody caught that, because that's a great point. And I don't wanna overlook the fact that I'm gonna be praying for you folks,
Thank you.
okay?
Mm-hmm.
But the question that you're bringing up is, with so much on the line, it's pretty important that the Bible that we have is trustworthy. And we're not gonna blaze by this like I'm blazing by these verses. We're gonna spend a whole class on that, okay? Thank you, Scott. So was Jesus God? Now, did others believe he was? And if so, when? Because I think the when question is pretty darn important too. I would counter this question with another question, and it's kind of like what you were saying, TC. Why would fiercely, and I mean fiercely monotheistic, meaning there's only one God. You have to know that for Jews who were growing up, the Shema, the prayer, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is what? One. That is what you grow up hearing and praying, you know. And so why would those people who grew up in that milieu give divinity to Jesus? Why would they commit blasphemy? Why would they do something that could have gotten them killed, could have gotten them stoned? I think that's maybe more of a rhetorical question, right? But it's one worth thinking about. Because tradition holds that all of the disciples met pretty gruesome ends for their faith. It's here that I think I'm going to dip a little bit into Scripture. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I don't know if anybody has a Bible handy, but if someone could just look up, get to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And while you do that, I think I might try to draw a little bit of a timeline.
What verse?
What would be, I mean,
It starts at 3, I think. 15:3, I think is where it starts.
okay, so let's go from 3 to
I
20.
think 7. Well, I think it's just 3 through 7, I think.
That's
Or
shorter.
8,
Let's do 3
just
through
off
8.
the top of my head.
Just keep reading until we're all just starting to jump.
Seven.
Is it 7?
Yeah.
It's 7.
Let's-
3 to 7.
Well,
I think you're right.
yeah, seven's probably good.
If
There's a
if
lot of
that's what
cooks in
you're
the
talking-
kitchen.
well,
Lots
if
of
that's
cooks in
what
the
you're
kitchen.
talking about.
Hey, let's do
Could've
1
probably been in
Corinthians
verse 6
verse
by now.
1 through 7. Can you read that for us?
1 through 7?
Yes, please, thank you.
Moreover, brethren, I declare you the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, and in which you stand, by which also you are saved, if you hold fast that word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered you, first of all, which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12. After that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. Verse 7, after that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles.
Thank you, and that was perfect. I'm drawing here a very crude timeline. And I'm trying to show you that here in the year 4 BC is the birth of Christ. Now, many people think, wait, wasn't it 0? We don't have time to get into that. Just trust me. So that would put, let's see, help me here. Yeah.
Which one?
Crucifixion. So we got to put that. So that's going to be what?
Maybe 30.
I think it's 33, but it's
Oh,
debated 30 or 33.
30,
It's
33.
accepted.
Can we just use 30 as an even number? And then, so Jesus' ministry, about 3 years, a little bit more, a little bit less?
The Bible just says about 3, so.
About 3. So maybe about year 27. Okay? So here's the ministry of Jesus. Now, when was 1 Corinthians written?
55-ish, right?
55?
Well, ish, right? Isn't it?
Ish.
I don't know, off the top of my head, I could be wrong about that.
Okay. Well, I'll blame you if you want. 55. All right. Now, we talked about this at lunch today. Some people, what I read mostly is that the epistles came first, gospels later. I'm hearing that there are some who believe gospels first, then the epistles. For the sake of tonight, just, accept my doctrine as true. Epistles first, and then gospels. So the epistles were written in this crucial time. And what did he say? There's some things that stuck out to me in what you just read about what Paul received. What were some of the things that he received? What did he hear?
What is he referring to as scripture? Because he's talking about scripture that talks about Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So if he's saying, as we've heard in the scriptures, he's referring to the life of Christ
He
in the
didn't
scriptures.
say in the scriptures, he
Well-
said that I received.
There were some other-
In the ESV it
It says
says
according to the
scriptures.
Scriptures.
Yeah.
Oh, according to the scriptures, I think meaning the Old Testament fulfillment of
Well,
prophecy.
Yeah.
Oh.
Because when
kinda
he
get
says
back
what
to
I
what Brett was
received,
saying.
that's in reference to a creed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
That's what
what I
I'm.
was saying.
That's what we're driving home the
I'm
point
sorry.
here.
Well, 'cause it
I'm
says
taking
that
this
Christ
class
died
back.
for us.
Yeah, I'm taking this
Can I
class
just
back.
say this one real quick? It
No,
says,
you failed. You
I'm
didn't get the 10
sorry.
minutes, and I'm not letting you talk.
I'm just, okay.
No, you have the floor.
In 15:3 it says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures." But Christ didn't die for their sin, are you talking about the Old Testament scriptures?
Well,
Or
it
the
could be,
refer-
but
Okay.
I'm one of those people that thinks the gospel.
Well, that's what I was trying to say, is,
So it could
I'm
be,
wondering
it
what.
could be in reference.
There's
So
a lot of
it could
conversation
be-
happening here.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me just kind of unpack what's happening in this moment.
It doesn't matter, it
No,
really actually.
Okay.
but it does, because what I brought up earlier was that there's some people who say epistles first, gospels second, or gospels first, epistles. It's these verses that you're bringing up calls them to go, Scriptures, Christ, that's, I imagine, one of many arguments that could be made one way or the other. For now, let's just put this under the umbrella
Sorry.
that New Testament, we have these Gospels and these epistles that are written. In my world, epistles are here, Gospels are happening here, okay? 1 Corinthians 15 is super important because you're hearing Paul in his own words talk about what he had received. And there are some who I have heard that said that he would have received what he wrote about maybe even as early as 3 or 7 years after the crucifixion. The claim that I were trying to debunk here is that this thing is myth, that this thing is made up, that somehow later centuries, way out over here, sorry sir, maybe 3rd or 4th century, look back on all this stuff and like, oh my gosh, we've got to invent something because we're losing traction. No, not at all. In fact, if you take a look at what Paul is saying here in 1 Corinthians 15, right here, in proximity to when Christ was crucified, and that's happening here. And then we had Pliny the Younger's letter in AD 112 that talked about they were worshiping, singing hymns to Christ as to a God. This, to me, draws a strong, that cumulative argument. That's part of the cumulative argument. Do we see worship of Christ here? Yes. Do we see worship of Christ here? Yes. Was this something that just emerged over time? Was this made up? No. Compare them. There's a strong correlation between the two. And I don't have time to get into my fun generation diagram, but that's my fault. So, finally, okay, so you say Jesus believes he was God, and some other people believed he was God. But I'm still not convinced that this thing is myth, because man, you remember that stuff I was talking about, Horus and Mithras and all these others? I think I got something here that'll help us, and this will be the last part of our class. Is it this one? Oh no. You got it. You have to be kidding me.
Well, thanks to all of you for coming out to our service this morning, and I pray that the rest of this Christmas day is wonderful for each and every one of you.
Not so fast, preacher man. Behold, it is I, Horus, Egyptian god of the sun, and while you all believe that you've been celebrating the birth of your Lord Jesus, you've really been celebrating the birth of me. For you see, thousands of years before your Jesus came around, I, Horus, was born on December 25th. I, Horus, was born of a virgin. I, Horus, was baptized by a man called Anup the Baptizer, was crucified and was resurrected 3 days later. So you see, your Jesus is nothing more than plagiarized poppycock. And I, Horus, have come to feast upon the sorrow of you foolish Christians.
Yeah, none of the stuff you just said is true.
Yes, it is.
No, there's no reference in Egyptian mythology to Horus being crucified or resurrected 3 days later. There's no documentation anywhere for the existence of a figure named Anup the Baptizer. Horus's mother was not a virgin woman, but the goddess Isis, and there is no specific date anywhere tied to the birth of Horus.
I'm pretty sure there is.
Actually, no. All of these claims and many others indicating that early Christians yoinked the mythology of Horus and stuck it on top of Jesus were all completely made up by Gerald Massey, a 19th century cuckoo banana bird self-taught Egyptologist who never provided the slightest shred of evidence for any of these claims and who was laughed out of the room by every serious Egyptologist on the planet. So thank you very much for your attempt to ruin our celebration of Christ's birth, but I'm afraid we're all still having a very Merry Christmas. Horus.
Horus? Did I say my name was Horus? No. What I meant to say was, behold, it is I, Mithras, Roman cultic god of the something, and while you all believe that you've been been celebrating the birth of Jesus, you've really been celebrating the birth of me. For you see, I, Mithras, was born of a virgin. I, Mithras, had 12 disciples, and I, Mithras, gave those disciples a meal consisting of my body and my blood. Sound familiar, Christian dummies?
Actually, Mithras was born from a rock, not of a virgin. He had 2 companions, not 12 disciples, and the Mithraic meal was one he shared with the sun god, where they feasted not on his own flesh, but on the flesh of a bull. But even if those claims were true, Christians were already confessing the virgin birth, recognizing the 12 apostles, and celebrating the Lord's Supper before they ever encountered any Mithraic cults. So I'm afraid that you've taken neither the holly nor the jolly out of our Christmas, Mithras.
Oh, you must have misheard me. I'm not Mithras. I'm, Quetzalcoatl, Aztec god of the wind. And Valuos thinks that you've...
No Christian on the face of the planet ever heard of Quetzalcoatl until the 16th century.
Then I'm Balder, Norse god of the...
There were 193 popes before Balder's mythology was actually written down.
Then I'm Horus, Egyptian god of the sun. Alright, fine. I didn't want to completely humiliate you, but you've left me no choice. I shall now unveil myself to be the ancient deity whose mythology was inarguably stolen by early Christians. Behold, I am...
the ancient Mesopotamian god of judgment. 6,000 years before your Jesus spoke of returning to condemn the lost and resurrect the faithful, my followers proclaimed that I would return to destroy my enemies and raise the dead. So silence your joyful voices, Christians. Your Lord is nothing but a cheap carbon copy of me, the destructor who goes by many names. I am Volgus Zildroha. I am Lord of the Sibulia. I am Gozer the Gozerian.
Gozer the Gozerian is from Ghostbusters.
Dang it, why do so many people still know that movie? If all the things that Gerald Massey said about me were complete fabrications, with no textual evidence whatsoever, why do atheists like Bill Maher reference these claims as if they were true?
Well, Horace, I suppose it is strange that people who insist that they won't believe anything without verifiable evidence are more than willing to believe anything without verifiable evidence, as long as that thing can be used to mock the gospel. But we shouldn't be surprised when people reject proof of Christ's resurrection in favor of demonstrable lies that let them remain in unbelief. After all, Jesus did say, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead.
I said that before Jesus did.
Oh, absolutely
All right. So, tonight, we asked the question, did Jesus exist? And we found a couple good reasons why we can say he did. We shouldn't be afraid of bias. The word bias, everyone's biased. And so we can use the Bible as a source. But there's also sources outside the Bible that help produce a cumulative case that Jesus really did exist. But not only did he exist, we asked, did he really believe he was God? Did other people believe he was God early? Was this a later invention? And I think we found out, no, it wasn't. In fact, it happened pretty darn close to the event. You would be hard-pressed to find any person, any historical figure in the first century who has that much evidence for their existence. And so I think with that, we are officially done. Yeah, that's my last slide. So I hope you've learned something tonight. I hope you had some fun. I hope I didn't offend you too much. I will edit the tape if I did. But thank you very much. If you have any questions, please see me or Scott or Brenda up here. Next week we will be same bat time, same bat channel. I think schedule-wise we're looking at Worldview next week. I think.
Worldview, nature of truth. Yeah.
Worldview, nature of truth. Very important stuff.
We're gonna talk about Star Wars. That's gonna be fun.
Yes. Okay. So thank you very much. I hope you have a great evening.
Good job.